Pensado's Place is brought to you by
Our guest goes from Trent Reznor to TV. We've got a brand new ITL, lots of stuff in the toy box for you guys. You're at the place. It's Pensado's Place.
Guys, man, thanks for being patient with us. We're back on the air, as you can probably tell, without too much effort. We took a little time off to make some adjustments, improve the quality of what we're bringing you, take some time to get some of the guests you've been asking us for, and it's great to be back. I'd be lying if I say I didn't miss being here. How about you, Herb? Did you have to go through withdrawals?
Yeah, they probably don't know. We stacked a few shows in the beginning for these guys so they've been watching. We were away for a bit, and we have a new toy, and we'll explain all that later, but that's thanks to you guys and our great sponsors. We're coming to you live from the Art Institute of California at Los Angeles. We're happy to be here.
Yes.
There's a lot of information. Let's get through it so we can get to the good stuff.
I'm ready.
You know our homework. You know the drill. Facebook, Twitter. Go to YouTube to our page. You know that. You see that up on the screen. Let's first of all get to our Telefunken winners. These are the winners of the M80 and the M81 mics. A great contest put together by our folks at Telefunken.
Great products.
We appreciate them. And the winners are Dave Rodriguez, Nicky, Calonne, and Darren Scorza. Congrats to them. Yay.
I thought it was going to be Dave Pensado for a second. I was like, yes, I
You're
won.
not eligible.
Oh, man.
Yeah, you're related to somebody who does
Let
the
the
show.
audience decide that. Will, let me know what they say.
They said no. So, if you're interested, you can check them out at those websites. We'll put those websites up. On to our Vintage King family. In the chat room is Darren Finley. Darren, hey, there's his information up on the screen. And I got to tell you, we spent some real great time with the Vintage King owners, Chevy, Jeffrey Ehrenberg. Tell them about VKLA.
Yeah, they built this facility that allows you to come in and A/B almost all the stuff in their product line, if not all, a lot, and you get to hands-on, so you get to compare speakers, converters, summing boxes. It's beautifully done, and the listening environment is high quality enough to where these comparisons actually mean something. I didn't want to leave. In fact, I tried to let them lock me in there.
They have built a world-class facility, unlike maybe another in the world. It is an appointment facility only, but they are not discriminating if you're a new guy and you got your first piece of gear, or if you're Dave. You can make an appointment and go in there, and I'm telling you, it's brilliant. Jeffrey Ehrenberg did brilliant work.
Have you ever been to Walmart with a big speaker display and you push the button and you get to hear different combinations of speakers for your cars? This is better than that.
This is on steroids.
This is better than that.
Absolutely. So a big shout to our Vintage King family.
Absolutely.
Well done.
Yeah.
Our other great and wonderful partners, the Avid team. Say hello to the Avid team.
Oh man, I got really good with my new HDX system this week.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I think I've got it down now.
We got a couple winners on the Avid side, too. The winner of the C400 is Kent Penagar. Congratulations, Kent. And in 2 weeks, we're going to be announcing the winner of the C600 giveaway. This is an expanded version of the C400. It's got some more interesting stuff on it. So make sure you enter there. You can go to Pensado's Place TV /Avid. And get all that information in.
Does this mean I have to bring them back from home? I can't use them anymore?
Yeah, you stole all the ones, and right now Drew is at your house stealing them back. So we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah, man, Drew's crazy busy these days. In case you wondered where he was.
Two other things. We got a really great reach out. This is what we call the toy box, which is all the toys for you. There's a program in the south of France called Mix with the Masters. They've asked Dave to come do it. It's an incredible program where you get to come and stay with your heroes and learn from them and mix with them and see the south of France and so forth. They reached out to us and they wanted to provide an opportunity for you guys to go there at their expense. The only thing you'd have to pay for is travel, but they will waive all the other fees. So we're going to do it as a sweepstakes. It's for a session featuring Eddie Kramer, who's got incredible stats, and a lot of other guests. So you definitely want to enter this. Again, that one, go to pensadosplace.tv/MWTM, Mix with the Masters.
Yeah,
Again,
it's like going on vacation, but getting to do audio. It's beautiful. They own their own they have a hotel that's part of the package. It's all in the south of France. If you've never been to the south of France, that alone is worth the entry fee.
So you're going to be responsible for travel. They will pick up everything else. We'll make sure that we get this announced. So you have 2 weeks to set the time.
I highly recommend this. It's really good.
Go to the website, and it's a very cool program, and they are very cool people. So congratulations to Victor and those guys.
Yeah.
Mix with the Masters, a great program. And last but not least, before we get to ITL, the Indaba Contest winner. Now, you spent a lot of time on that.
Man.
Tell them how you process this.
Will Thompson, our producer, is a gifted audio engineer, and so Will narrowed it down to around 100, and then I took it from there. And I used what I did, guys. I tried to come up with a system. I had 10 categories: bass, drums, vocals, guitars, effects, EQ, high and low, emotion and feel, vibe, creativity, and how much I liked it. And I gave each one of those a 1 to 10, and I divided that by 10. And I narrowed it down to 3 finalists: Damien Reynaud, Aaron Meyer, and Ilya Silkin. And Damien Reynaud was the winner. Incredible job. I felt the mix. It stood out above the others, but I'm telling you, all the ones that I listened to all had at least something that was great, and most of them shined in at least 6 of those categories. After I divide by 10, it becomes a 1 to 10 scale, and you can see her, but I had tons of 8s, tons of 9s, tons of 7s. I never gave anybody anything below a 6. We've been doing a good job with our audience.
Should I tell them that there's actually nothing on the paper?
No, please. I worked my butt off on this.
I have to know for a fact that both Indaba and Will and Dave worked very hard on this. We wanted to make sure that we listen to things, and so you guys know that.
I didn't just listen once. I listened multiple times. Because what happens, Herb, is when you start off, everything sounds good, and by the end, you can compare. So I had to reverse and take a day off and go back and listen to everything in reverse order, and my scores were slightly different, so I averaged those. Cool. I really took it serious, guys. So congratulations to Damien Reynaud. We're proud of you. Let's go to ITL, Dave, and what's the ITL about? It's a tiny bit of a potpourri. There's several things that you guys have been asking me about, and some of it I discussed in broad terms. So this is more like a laser focus on some of the things you've been asking me to do, and I hope you like it. Hey, welcome to episode number 4,361 of Into the Lair. Missed you guys, we're back. And I wanted, Will and I have been getting a lot of questions about how I use auxes and kind of how I set things up. So I've explained this a couple of times, but I'm going to explain it again from a little bit slightly different angle this time. Auxes have, or whatever your DAW calls them, where you take a bunch of tracks and you combine them into one stereo track, and then it gives you control over the process like nothing else. So let's jump right in and see what we got. This is a song by AVM, a group out of Chicago, my friend Robert, and I love this song, so I think it's going to be a great example of how this works, because I used it pretty thoroughly in mixing this record. I'm Not Crying Over You. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to start with the drums. Now this is a live drum kit, but it applies to anything you're doing. Now I can take all the drums and feed them to the aux. Now I can put compression on that aux, but now the compressor is being controlled by everything. So let's trim the drums down a little bit before we send them to the aux, and do a little bit of compression at that point in the stage. We'll do a little compression at the aux, and then we'll do a little compression on the stereo bus. Here's my kick drum, the way it sounds. Okay, now you can see here I'm parallel compressing. So let's take the parallel off. So by doing that, I've gained probably a little advantage. Now, same thing with the snare. Okay, now let's send all that to our aux and see what happens. I've got 5 auxes, vocal, drums, music, bass, and effects, and I'll explain each one of them. Now, here's my drum aux. Now here's my favorite compressor on the drum aux. Now we can use this guy, or we can use just a traditional compressor. Now if we use a traditional compressor on the drum aux, let's shoot for a low ratio, 2:1, and slow attack. And so I'm going to A-B the 2, and let's see if we can tell the difference. Let's start with the L2007. Just a preference choice. They both sound really good, but they both sound about the same. Now let's see what all this is doing when we get up here to our stereo bus aux. Okay, let's listen with my parallel chain off on the individual drums, the aux compressor off, and the stereo bus compressor off. And I'm going to add these back, so watch the screen. Okay, so you can see how a little bit of lifting along the way, and without having all the drums go to an aux, I couldn't accomplish this. And then the way I have a print track on my stereo bus, and then I use a master fader. You can see how each one of those affects the chain. Now, okay, I'm gonna show you the same process with guitars now. Let's go. The 2 main guitar tracks are this red one and the green one. Okay, now they're being each sent to their individual auxes. I'm going to highlight the auxes that they're being sent to. Now let's take the stuff off the auxes and see what we get. Okay, now let's go back to our music aux. Okay, all I'm adding is 2 dB at 800. It makes a big difference in the power of the track. So you can see we kind of grouped the guitars to their own auxes, and then I tied those 2 auxes together so I can manipulate them simultaneously. Then we sent those 2 auxes to our master, not master aux, but our like granddaddy aux for music, and then that's being sent to the stereo bus. Let's check something out. Once I get all this information to the auxes the way I want, I have a different level of control. What do I mean By that, let me show you. If you look closely at the auxes, you'll notice that I actually have volume rides on the drum aux, on the music aux, and on the effects aux. Now, what I wanted to do, let's start from the bottom. The effects all go through their own aux. Now, on the first verse, I wanted a little less effects on everything so that that verse would have an intimacy. Let's listen to a piece of that. Okay, so you see that creates kind of an intimacy, drier vocal for the first verse, and then the effects just increase through the chorus, and then I probably should have pulled them back a hair in the second verse, but I didn't. Now let's see what's going on. I wanted the guitars to have a little more power coming into the first chorus, so watch this. Here's the chorus right here. Now right here you'll see it ramps up a bit. I wanted the guitars to get a little bit louder. The end of the song is really important. It's a big build up. Now you can see I've taken the drums and I've ramped the drums up. So if I play you the song here, there's one level. Now you can see how powerful that is. Now here it's another level. If I didn't have auxes, I could do that with the individual tracks, but it's going to sound differently because then the individual tracks don't have a unifying, gluing element like the aux does with global compression, global EQ. You guys are smart. You get the idea. Another thing I like to do with an aux, if you look up here, I've got one of my favorite tape machine emulations. Now, I did this mix before Slate Digital came out with their tape machine. I like it a lot too. So here's kind of giving the whole mix that vibe as if I'd printed it to tape. So I'll do. It's pretty subtle, but it's noticeable. I love what that's doing. I think I'm using the Chuck Ainley smooth vocal preset. I don't think I changed it. So what have we learned? I think that it can be argued that nothing in the audio world is free. If you take an equalizer, plug in or analog, and put it across something, you lose. No doubt about it, you lose something. But no doubt about it, you gain something. So if you gain more than you lose, it's a trade-off. And auxes are the same way. Nothing is free. You lose something when you go to an aux. For me personally, I think I gain 99% and lose 1% because of the control I have. And auxes can be thought of as little blocks of energy, emotion, feel, vibe, and so it gives you a better control over those intangible factors than individual tracks might. One little aside, we all talk about how loud music has become and how it's in your face, there's no dynamics. Well, that's a function of the culture. The culture determines what we do because they tell us how they want their music to sound. Now we can lead, and I think that's part of the responsibility of an engineer to try and lead the culture, but at some point in time the culture demands what it wants. Now in the visual world, people are complaining that edits are too quick, like there'll be 20 edits in a second, and people follow that. People are playing video games all day, and they like a faster pace. Now the audio equivalent of that could be argued that people want their music loud and in their face. They don't want a 60-second intro. they don't have time or the patience to listen to a 12-song album. They want their one song, they want it quick, they want it loud. Now these techniques can help you accomplish that. Now, in accomplishing that, you can still maintain the dynamics and artfulness and vibe and feeling of the song by using this aux technique. Now that's not the only technique, but it's a tool that you can use to kind of get the best of both worlds. So just always remember, it's better to sound new than sound good. But on Pensado's place, we try to do both. Next time. Hey guys, hope you got something out of that. Today we're going to do a little different, Herb. I want to kind of just do his introduction as we go along. His life is so varied and so unique. Welcome, Charlie Clouser.
Hey,
good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Handshake.
There you go.
Your career path is probably not something anyone should try in its entirety, but there's chunks of it that I think would, if not be fascinating, would at least be helpful to some of our viewers. Can you take me on the
Charlie ride?
Well, you know, I played musical instruments as a kid, played piano for a week until I didn't want to practice anymore, and I wound up playing the drums. Played in bad bands in high school in a little town in Vermont, and went to a college that was a little bit, in those days, I mean, I went to college in 81 through 85, and it was a little bit of a freaky college where you get evaluations, not grades, and you don't have to take geography and French if you don't want to. And they actually had an electronic music studio, and I wound up studying electronic music at college.
In the 80s?
Yeah.
Wow.
And in those days, you know, the electronic music studio at college was a great big old ARP 2500 modular synth and 4 Scully 4-track machines.
Right.
And that was it.
Right, right.
And it was tape loops and modular synthesizers and sound collages and all that kind of stuff. There was no, you know, drum machines. This was, you know, pretty much before MIDI was really on the scene. So you weren't like cooking up songs, really.
Right, right.
You were cooking up weird stuff. But it was great experimentation time, you know. And I actually took a field study my 3rd year of college and went to Institute of Audio Research in New York, which at that time was like one of, I don't know, 2 or 3 places where you go to learn to become a recording engineer, you know. Wow. And there was no bands coming into sessions. It was like, okay, get out your soldering irons. We're going to build a simple equalizer today. You know, it was very, it was very like old style. You know, the dean of the school at the time was the chairman of the AES, so it was very like old style education. You know, and that was, I was able to use that as a way to satisfy some of my academic requirements at college. When I came out of college, I moved back. That school was in New York, and I was going to school in Massachusetts. So when I got out of college, I figured, well, time to hit the big city. Went to New York, and I had an electronic music band in college, and you know, we were going to move to New York and get a record contract. And you can imagine what happened.
Sure.
So about a year later, I'm down in front of Sam Ash Music on 48th Street, and they put out a Help Wanted sign, and I was like, and I used to go in that store every day anyway to play with.
Were you standing there when they put the sign out?
I literally was. And I, you know, and back in those days, you know, you figured there's going to be a waiting list for guys that want to work at Sam Ash, because I knew they had an employee discount.
Sure.
You know.
Oh, absolutely.
And I knew that if you, because I was there anyway every day playing with drum machines and just generally getting in their hair.
Right.
So, and that worked out real well, because when I started working there, there was, you know, this rickety old A-frame keyboard stand in the back of the store that had like an Apple II and a Commodore 64 on it, and that was their computer department. And they were like, "Hey, new guy, that's your problem now. Wow. You know how to use a computer, right?" And I had, you know, my little Commodore 64 and everything. And so they made that my gig at the store. And over the 2.5, 3 years that I worked there was really when like MIDI and computer sequencers and software really started to come on strong. And so the whole thing exploded just in the time that I was there. And I was kind of the point man.
I was going to say, that would make you the man. Then.
Oh, it was great. I mean, by the time I stopped working there, I'd show up to work and there'd be already 10 people waiting with their questions. You know, if anybody came in the store and said, I heard that you can print out sheet music on a computer, they go, see that guy, see that guy. So I just had to sit there and
tell him why you got fired.
Well, yeah. I mean, the guy that, you know, when they hired me, they literally put me to work that day. They were like, you know, they asked me a couple dumb questions, said, "Great, punch in." And one of my customers at the store, who I've been real nice to, was an Australian composer who had done movie and TV scores over in Australia, and he was coming to New York to, you know, I getting a little ahead of myself. He'd come over once or twice a year to like buy stuff from New York City, and then go back and take it back to Australia. And eventually, in the second year when I was working there, he came in the store and he was going to be setting up a studio, just a little MIDI studio, to do the score for a TV show called The Equalizer, which was on CBS back in the 80s. And he came to, you know, buy a whole bunch of gear from me and set it up. And in those days, a big MIDI setup was a little Macintosh Plus and a Korg M1 keyboard and you know, stuff that we'd consider crude by today's standards. And so I would go up after work and set up the system for him, and then I wound up programming drums and scary noises and not really writing the cues, but doing all the accoutrements around it and kind of working the production workflow, helping with the mix down and stuff. And so I would go up there after work and work later and later, and started coming into work later and later. Then I'm 15 minutes late, then I'm half an hour late, and then after, you know, a month or two, I showed up, and I think I was like an hour and a half late, and my boss, the manager, who had hired me, was waiting for me by the door. And I'm trying to be all slick and come in with my coffee already half drunk, so it looks like I just went across the street for a coffee, and no, I've been punched in for an hour, Paul. No, it didn't work, no. He was waiting for me, and he kind of very gently said, so I noticed you've been keep burning the midnight oil. And he very carefully asked me, is it a good gig? I mean, is this something that's going to be steady? This isn't just like, you're not just out partying. I was like, no, I think it's a good gig. I think it could turn into something. And he's like, good. And I said, I shouldn't need it. Yeah, I was like, so I shouldn't bother punching in, should I? And he was like, no, let's go get breakfast across the street.
That was really cool.
But he was one of the, and you know, someone I remained friends with. You know, shout out to Paul Rice, who was a manager at Sam Ash and eventually went on to work in the music in the MI industry. You know, working at, he was vice president of Mackey for a while, and so he's still out there somewhere. So I see him at damn shows.
This is all pre Nine Inch Nails, pre Rob Zombie, all of that.
Oh, yeah.
We'll get to that in a second. But one of the things that captured Herb's and mine's imagination was the cost of your first computer and hard drive.
Oh man, I mean, you know, my first computer was a Commodore 64, and then we went to the IBM PC portable with the fold-down keyboard and the 2 floppy drives.
Compact.
And then eventually, you know, had the Mac Plus, then the Macintosh 2. Remember those? And that at one point there, I do remember there was a DigiDesign Pro Store hard drive that was 600 megabytes, which was couldn't believe. It was
unfathomable.
You could hold a whole CD of stereo mixes on it.
Right.
And I think it was $5,995. And I was kind of doing the math in my head, and I think that's, I think storage now is 140,000 times cheaper than that was.
Oh my God.
And that was in the days when, you know, you'd save up your paychecks from Sam Ash for a month to, you know.
And this is right about the time you took up guitar too. Who'd you learn to play guitar with?
Well, that kind of came a little bit later. That was when I first was kicking around in the 9 Inch Nails camp, and you know, I always had guitars but didn't know what I was doing.
Well, that's the definition of a guitar player.
Yeah, right. But
I am one.
Eventually, when I started hanging around with the guys from 9 Inch Nails, Danny Lohner, who was the guitar player in the band, was, you know, showed me the magic of drop tuning. And then I was like, oh, you mean I can just use one finger? Okay, I can do this. And so that put me down that dusty trail, you know.
And that, I mean, how long did you stay with 9 Inch Nails? That was like
several
years, right?
It was about 8 years, I think, altogether.
Wow. And you can't interview Bruce Swedien without asking him what mic he used on Thriller. I can't interview anybody that got anywhere close to Trent Reznor without asking a couple of Trent Reznor questions. Did you learn a lot from Trent?
Oh yeah. I mean, by the time I got into that camp, I was had been doing remixes and programming for bands like White Zombie and Prong and other kind of real heavy rock bands that wanted to have some element of weirdness injected into there, not just straight up like synth-based parts, but just wanted to have some kind of sample remix technology integrated into their albums. So on White Zombie, I was doing like drum loops and chopping them up to match, so the drum loops would match the timing of the live drummer. This was way before Beat Detective and Ableton Live and all that, so we did it, you know, it was the hard way. And so I kind of already had a big collection of old synthesizers and computers and this and that. But you know, once I got into the 9 Inch Nails camp, that was in the years when it was just on stun, you know, and we toured with I joined kind of in the middle of a tour, and we were out for about a year at that point. And then when we finished that tour, we wound up in New Orleans at Mardi Gras, which is a bad time to end a tour.
Is this when you were recording in the funeral home?
Yeah.
In the mortuary?
Yeah. And that was right.
Gosh.
And, you know, at that point, up until then, Trent had been based out of Los Angeles and was just looking for a way to kind of get outside the loop and just get a little more solitude and peace and quiet. And New Orleans kind of struck a chord with him, and so he set up camp there. And,
where's he from?
You know, he's from Pennsylvania.
Wow.
And kind of in some of the same areas that I grew up in.
Did he and Marilyn Manson know each other prior to them working together? Because you worked on Marilyn Manson also.
Yeah.
Was that at the funeral home?
Yeah.
So, oh gosh, that's great.
And
I'm
a
so
little
happy to hear that.
bit of it also was at his house that he had been renting before up in Benedict Canyon out here in Los Angeles. But Manson was, you know, their band was from Florida, and we had, you know, I think Trent had seen them playing on an off night, like when he was on tour down there, and saw them and thought, you know.
Manson was actually living in the Manson house, wasn't he, or something?
Well, Trent was. That was the
Trent
house.
was living in the Manson house.
There's the studio that he had up in Benedict Canyon was actually the house that the Sharon Tate murders occurred in. And it was a beautiful house, perfect place to put a studio.
Right.
And it's since been torn down, and they built some gigantic McMansion up there. But
McMansion. Hey, Charlie. I'm gonna stop the history tour for a second. You said something that really piqued my interest. How do you approach keyboards for an ultra hard rock band as opposed to, say, what we're going to discuss later on? Your career is now morphed into film and TV and scoring and all that. What's the difference in approach to creating sounds? Like, do you try to like a neophyte like myself to that world would assume you try to create a lot of buzzy sounds, a lot of aggressive sounds for the rock thing, whereas you try to create atmospheric sounds. Can you kind of give me insight and give our guys insight into how to start that world?
I think you're definitely on the right track with what you were saying, and that, you know, I was always attracted to big, powerful, and ugly kind of sounds, and I didn't,
kind of like your women.
Exactly.
Okay.
You know, and I was always a fan of, you know, it's a huge fan of craft work, but that wasn't the kind of music I did.
Right,
and
right.
I loved it for what it was, and I could appreciate it.
They were groundbreaking.
I wasn't really in that world with the stuff that I was doing. But when you're talking about bands like, you know, White Zombie, Rob Zombie, and Prong, and, you know, Rammstein, and bands like that, there was surprisingly little. There is kind of a narrow scope of sounds that kind of fit against all those textures and don't kind of sound like they're on a whole separate layer that's been grafted on there. A big part of what I was doing was really oriented around samplers. And I've always, you know, loved using samplers ever since my first Sonic Mirage back in the day, you know, and a lot of what I was doing was either chopping up and manipulating drum loops and stacking them up and compressing the crap out of them and kind of tucking those behind the real drummer to make them sound, kind of have a little bit of that early hip-hop feel with those really squashed drum loops.
If you naturally have an affinity for what kind of sound, what would that sound be that you would say, okay, now you could have a career working with rock bands? What would that sound be?
You know, again, we're 15 years later, and the whole tastes have, the integration of these heavier, uglier sounds into rock has really become more of a,
you know, now I was thinking when you were doing it, you had to be one of the few people even thinking that way.
I mean, it was kind of weird at the time when, you know, White Zombie, when I first came in to start working with them, that was like power trio, pure rock. It had nothing to do with like high-tech samplers and synthesizers. And it was, and you know, at the very beginning of that, it was really Rob Zombie that was pushing that. He's like, this is how we need to go. And the rest of the band are kind of like, who's this guy you're bringing in with his computers and stuff, you know?
I was mixing a rap record in the mid-'90s at Larrabee West, which is now non-existent, but Rob was next door with White Zombie, and he kept coming over into my control room asking me for loops, and he was he's a pretty inventive, creative guy.
Dude.
He's not going to let any boundaries control him. He just was just like all over the road.
And you know, he's incredibly, despite his onstage persona, he's an incredibly well-read, and he really likes a variety of music and can see kind of a path to integrating these other things in, and it sure worked, you know. And there wasn't a lot of you know, bleepy bloopy kind of synthesizers. It would just be a little bit here and there. But I mean, back on the early White Zombie stuff, I got the most mileage out of my old Roland MKS-80 Super Jupiter, and just these big unison square wave type of sounds that the kind of sounds that seem like they're trying to sound like heavy guitar.
Right.
And sort of are still in that, like you were saying, in that buzzy, kind of almost detuned, real fat, chunky.
So there is a detune element when you combine the oscillators.
Exactly.
Kind of like a guitar might be not perfect.
Exactly.
Because the intonation varies. Okay, I never thought about that. Now, I don't want to give the plot away, but let's move to the live part of your let's call it your journey, and a little bit of what you went through, and what correlation is there for, if any, of creating sounds for when you were allowed to for the live show as opposed to the records?
Well, that was, you know, and this was another case in which, you know, Trent was really smart about how he approached the live versions of the records, because a lot of his records, well, all of them, are kind of studio gems. You know, there's a lot of what you're hearing and why you like the sounds and the way they're put together is really, it's not based on a bunch of guys jamming. It's based on studio, scratching your head and endless listening. And when he would set out to create a live version of one of his tracks, it wasn't about trying to duplicate exactly what was going on in the studio. And you know, one example was, there was a song from the album The Fragile called Star Bleepers Incorporated, and in the studio, the whole track, the whole sort of drum track that goes on in the verse, was this thing I did on an old Revolution drum machine, which was kind of like an 808 type of drum machine.
I haven't even heard of that.
It's this weird German drum machine from this company that was making like keyboards that you explicitly designed for techno music. You know, Quasi MIDI was the company.
Right.
And I had this drum machine, and I put it through a bunch of guitar pedals and created this, you know, single mono audio track that sounded like there was bass in it because of the 808 kicks all through the distortion. They sounded like a synth bass, and it was just this sort of slab of noise that kind of was the sort of drums and bass in the verse. And I remember thinking, wow, this whole song is going to be one that we're really going to have to dissect that stuff and put it on backing tapes and play along to it. And, you know, out of all the songs that we were preparing for that tour, that would have been the one that needed the most stuff on playback. And, you know, in another tribute to Trent's forward thinking, he was like, no, on this one, we're not going to use any backing. We're going to play a completely free ball live. You know, because for many of the songs there was
What does free ball mean?
Well, commando style. You know? That was a term that he used to throw around. He's like, no, we're just going to free ball it.
We're talking literal.
Yeah.
I know what it means.
And,
it now.
you know,
Really?
too much information. And that was, you know, an example where he said, no, out of all this, you know, me and the other guys in the band are like, oh, we're going to have to dissect all these complicated little keyboard parts and they're all sequency. We're going to have to put them on the backing. And he was like, no, we're going to play this one completely live. So I wound up just taking that synth and drum track and taking about 2 bars of it and chopping it up using that program Recycle that lets you chop a loop up into little pieces. And I chopped it up into like the kick piece and then the snare piece. And I think that's kind of all I had, about 3 different slices. And I would just kind of trigger those pieces manually in time to what the real drummer was playing. And
So he played to a click track, obviously.
no.
Oh, he
just counted out. He just freeballed it. Yeah.
Wow.
And you know, on a lot of tracks live, we would have. In those days, we were using a Tascam D88, you know, an 8-track digital machine, and there'd be a track of click, and then a track of synth bass, because a lot of Nine Inch Nails songs would have a, you know, a very obviously mechanical sequence synth. There was no computers on stage, no sequencers. It would just, usually on that backing tape was literally just a mono synth bass and a click. And occasionally there would be a stereo pair of, like if some song starts off with an obvious drum machine beat or something, and you could tell it wasn't the drummer faking it because he's kind of sitting back waiting for his part to come in.
Right.
And so, but that was one of those examples of where I thought, and the other guys in the band thought, oh, we're going to really have to put a lot of stuff on the backing. And, you know, Trent said, you know, let's flip it and go completely in the other direction, and we're going to play it completely live. And that creates like a different, you know, widens the gap between what you hear on the record and what you hear live, and really gave the band more opportunity to kind of flail around and not make it sound like we're jumping around while something's playing back behind us. You know?
Right.
This is my last Trent Reznor question. When you said that he tried to create studio gyms and people sitting around scratching their head, can you describe briefly one of those sessions where you were sitting around trying to create a gym and scratching your head? What went on? What impressed you about the creative process that Trent was utilizing to create those moments?
You know, a lot of it is turning things on their head and going the opposite of what the rest of us knuckleheads would have thought.
Right,
you know,
right.
And you know, one thing was there's a whole phase there where I had been coming out of doing bands like White Zombie and Prong and stuff, and you'd use a lot of crash cymbal. You put a crash cymbal on the downbeat of every section, and you know, and his whole thing was, for a while there was just no crash cymbals at all, to, you know, because that's a trick you use to help out on the downbeat, make that chorus really sound like it's busting in. And he would flip it on its head and be like, no, we're not going to use that trick, that little cheat, to make that chorus sound like it's really dropping in. And so he'd establish these kind of internal rules for himself that would kind of go against what you'd expect. And, you know, in a way that limits the set of options, but really kind of pushes the music into a whole new direction.
And he creates a signature.
Exactly, and you're like, you don't necessarily understand at first why this song sounds so different to other stuff out there unless you kind of get inside it and realize, you know what, there's not one crash cymbal hit on this whole album on a downbeat.
That's cool.
And he would do things like use, you know, for a while there he used the Parker guitars, which had a little piezo pickup in the bridge that sounded real thin and weedy and was intended, I guess, to simulate acoustic stuff live.
The Parker's the one without the headstock, right?
No, the Parker's the one that has a real strange angular horn that digs into your chest bone in just the wrong spot.
I hated that guitar.
And he would use that, you know, back in this was sort of right when like amp simulators were first kind of getting popular and like the Pod had just come out. And he would use this Parker not through these amp simulators that the rest of us were like, oh yeah, put it on the rectifier setting. And he would use this thin and little weedy piezo output and really get some sounds that were unexpected because he was kind of, well, I'm not going to use the normal output, I'll use the one that no one ever uses. So it was a great, you know, he has a great way of looking at the other side of an approach and taking that route, which, you know, really helps the uniqueness of the sounds, you know.
I'm sorry.
Oh, it's 3 or 4 minutes before batter's box. Fast forward, if you would, if I'm not cutting you off.
We're going to say the same thing. Okay. I can't wait to hear his scoring life, how that evolved.
So get to TV scoring, how it came into your life, and translate kind of what that means to our crowd.
Well, I had, you know, so I was lucky enough to get hired out of the music store by a guy that was doing the scoring back in the 80s. I kind of already been around the edges watching this go down and watching how they put cues together and watching how they can make a whole piece of music out of just 4 piano notes and a little bit of strings and stuff. And that was very different to the other music that I wound up working on for the next 10 years, you know, because I stopped working with that composer in the, you know, like 90, 91, spent 10, 12 years doing the bands and remixes and 9 Inch Nails stuff. But I had done that. I knew the kind of the workflow and what was required, even though I wasn't in the driver's seat back in the 80s. So, you know, in the early 2000s, I came back to Los Angeles and produced a couple albums and was, you know, trying to go down the producer mixer route and reunited with that Australian composer, the same guy who I'd stayed in touch with over the years. And he said, hey, there's some TV shows kicking around. Would you fancy teaming up on one? So the two of us teamed up together, and I was now taking much more of a central role in the things. I had a lot more experience, and the two of us teamed up and did a TV series on Fox called Fastlane. We did 26 episodes of that for that one season. And that really got me back. Now I was back in that workflow, but now I was in the driver's seat. I was playing the keyboards and I was writing the cues. And that was, you know, I wasn't strictly a guy who used to be in a band now wanting to move into the scoring. I already had 10 years prior enough experience, so it wasn't a mystery, you know, what was needed.
So, some of my audience, and you can put me in this category, I'm familiar with the word cue and what a cue is, but when you're composing for a cue, you've got the the picture in front of you,
Yep.
and then you're trying to create music that would fit underneath that picture, and you're very good at that, and you have some philosophies about that. Explain your philosophy in terms of the. I think you said something about how important it is to create, to capture the emotion and the sensitivity of that cue, and so you're working with SMPTE. You have to lock your music to the SMPTE you're given on the cue, right? Can you kind of take our audience, because a lot of our people want to do that.
I mean, a lot of what helps a lot is when there's a temp score in place where they've taken music from, big movies that they love and that they wish they could have
Copyrighted music.
Exactly. That's not, that's just the music they throw in as an example.
Sure.
A lot of times they'll use that music as a sort of metric. Even while they're editing the picture, they might put up a piece of music and kind of cut the picture
to that,
so it has a little bit of a rhythm to it. So sometimes you can listen to that temp score and see if rhythmically it matches up, and you can kind of get an idea of a tempo you might want to use.
So the cues come after editing?
Well, sometimes, for instance, on the Saw movies, the picture editor, Kevin Greuter, who cut almost all the Saw movies, he would put music in and use that as a way to create an internal rhythm for the picture cuts. And so then when
that would influence you.
Exactly. So when I sat down to do my thing, then I could look at that tempo and spend a little bit of time listening to just click tracks against the picture and see if stuff is lining up so it looks like those edits are happening on the beat. And so once you've taken the time to get the tempos right, then you have this framework where you can just play now. Exactly. And you're not like bummed out because you were 1.5 bars short of your phrase ending when the scene ends.
Right.
Does the scene impart a natural tempo to you when you see the scene? Do you think, okay, 118 beats a minute?
I mean, again, it comes down to I spend a lot of time
that's what you feel.
Listening to clicks, or sometimes I have a little box that you can tap to get a tempo, and a lot of times I'll just watch with the sound off and tap and try to see if there's some kind of rhythm either to the character's motion or to the edits.
And harmonic content-wise, what's going through? Are you thinking atmosphere or harmonic content, or both, or it varies?
The atmosphere. There's so many great ways to create atmospheres with synthesizers and effects and stuff. That's almost like a freebie for me nowadays. And the thing I try to concentrate on is the tempo and the metrics of the thing. So you got exactly, an 8-bar phrase.
What is metrics?
Just so that an 8-bar phrase would fit exactly from when the door slams to when the guy shoots the gun or whatever. And not have it feel like that musical phrase wasn't finished or something, And once I got that,
oh, I see, yeah.
And I'll fiddle with the tempos so that lines up exactly. And then I start going and worrying about where do I need to modulate, and where do I need to, I could be cruising along in D for a while and then want to drop down a third and trying to find that, what I call a hinge point, like where something hinges,
So like if you're in D, you might go to a G, to an A, but you always, within that framework, come back to the tonic D. At some point, you resolve it, or you try to leave it unresolved?
Sometimes I'll leave it hanging. I mean, a great example of that is like in a lot of the old James Bond movies, the classic James Bond theme would play, and then they'd, at the end, right when they're going into the first scene of the movie, quote unquote, they just drop down a half step and kind of leave, and all of a sudden you go, ooh, now I'm. What's going on? Yeah,
it's kind of like that, and then, and then the diminished chords that they used in cartoons. Oh, gotcha. That's fascinating.
There's some tricks to be had.
Herb has been trying to organize an entire month on this sort of thing, and I can't wait for that to happen. It's pretty fascinating, isn't it, Herb?
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. I think for our crowd, we're constantly trying to show, obviously, the importance of audio, and it's important in so many places, and there's a number of ways you can approach your career, and so this kind of exposure, not only is fascinating for us to learn, it's fascinating for them to hear from.
Yeah. Can I guess one quick thing?
You can.
Charlie, in terms of this modern world you found yourself in, you must use Ableton in this because it seems like it's tailor-made for this world.
Yeah.
How do you integrate Ableton in with your Pro Tools and Logic and the system? Is it a very major part of your...
Oh yeah, it's I jumped on Ableton when it first came out, which was a little bit before I was back into the scoring side of things. And I primarily do everything in Logic, but I do use Ableton quite a bit, and I run it as a Rewire slave behind Logic, so that you know, if you mark off a loop range in Logic, that same range will be highlighted in Ableton when you bring it to the front. So you can very easily build, and I don't use Ableton in the clip launching mode, which is the main page that people use. I strictly use the big arrange page. It looks like Pro Tools, where you're laying waveforms out over time. And having it slaved on the same computer using Rewire behind Logic means you can create your markers in Logic to delineate the different scenes and so forth, and then you can highlight that 16 bars or whatever in Logic, flip over to Ableton, and you can see that range marked off on the screen. So it makes it very simple to lay out sounds, because you're kind of creating a duplicate of your arrangement. So you got to create a whole complex arrangement over in Ableton, and then record or bounce that over into Logic. And having them slaved behind each other makes that real simple.
One day would you teach me how to get up to speed on Rewire? I really want to learn that process.
Oh, it's pretty fantastic.
I got to learn that. It's just so many uses in the mix world. Batter's box.
Warm up the arm there, sir. It's time for batter's box, and let's get a few in.
Bass. Synth bass.
Well, for bass, I use a lot of bass guitar, and generally use a Music Man Stingray, a Music Man Sterling, the little one, passive,
Really?
which was made for us when I was in Nine Inch Nails without active electronics, so it's simpler. Avalon U5DI, because it's the only thing I found that doesn't break up the signal in any way, and you can hear crystal clear tones. And a Sansamp RBI, which is their little rack mount, you know, $200 rack mount. Love the way that thing sounds.
Out of the park.
It's going to be tough, and I'll get him. Piano.
I use a lot of plug-in pianos. One of my favorites is an old sample bank from the Giga sampler days called the Malmo Grand, which sounds like it's 1,000 miles away. It's soft and distant and just has a real lovely, even tone, because usually my piano parts are just real quiet stuff, and it just wants to sound distant. I do have a real piano, which I mostly use for weird effects, like rubbing on the strings and stuff. And I just
watch this.
You have to back him off the plate.
Watch this.
Okay.
My talent cannot be controlled or contained. What is your favorite auto-tune setting for a theremin?
Ooh. Yeah, that was a trick.
He's actually done that.
Yeah, that was a trick that at one point on the Fragile tours, Trent said, "Why don't you break out the theremin on a couple songs?" And I said, "That's one of the least visually interesting. That's going to look so boring because I'll be posed up on the stage." So what we did was, I got the Antares Auto-Tune rack unit that had just come out back then. Take the theremin through Auto-Tune, out of Auto-Tune, and then into delay and distortion, and tell the Auto-Tune rack to only allow like 3 notes in the octave, and then you can throw the thing around and you can wiggle your hands, and just about everything you do will wind up
being in tune,
pushed into one of those 3 notes.
I got you.
And that works fine. That works great for theremin.
Great answer. Penalty for length of time. Guitar.
Use a lot of guitar rig. Got a lot of pods. I have every pod that I ever bought, but tons of old pedals. And that was one thing Trent did a lot of too.
Guitar rig 3 or 4?
4.
4. Pads.
Love Omnisphere. Use Omnisphere plug-in quite a bit.
Okay. Rhodes type sounds.
You know, I still use the built-in, free of charge Rhodes simulator that comes in Logic, the EVP. And I use that all over the place on TV scores. And that just had a great full, maybe not realistic, but for scoring purposes, I loved it.
Mini Moog lead type sounds.
I do have a Mini Moog Voyager, which I love. The little XY touch plate on there is fantastic. And I also have a big Eurorack modular synthesizer that I use I have a ribbon controller that I use for a lot of wacky doodle stuff.
Okay, here comes the hard part. What's your favorite synthesizer of any type or genre for writing and being creative? When you get an idea and you want to flesh it out quickly, what do you grab first?
If I need to flesh something out quickly, it probably wouldn't be something like Omnisphere where you can spend months flipping through sounds and just like you can get yourself lost. I would say if I was gonna, I would go to the Mini Moog Voyager or something that has a limit, some kind of limited scope, so you don't spend a month wandering.
Okay, that didn't get him hurt. Try this one, big boy.
All right.
Best synth under $1,500. Best synth under $1,500.
That is a tough one.
And then after you figure that one out, I want your best virtual synth under $100.
Oh,
wow.
Okay.
Ooh, those are
For
heaters.
hardware synth,
Those are heaters.
how much is a Moog Slim Fatty, the little rack mount?
I'll give you that one.
Okay.
I'll give you $200 on the virtual.
That's going to be a tough one. Let's see.
Not with your little fancy schmancy 9-inch nails discount.
You know,
this has to be retail.
I don't know if it fits. I think it's $250.
I'll take it.
Alchemy by Camel Audio.
Okay.
A real oddball, but
I concede defeat.
But you threw heaters. You threw heaters, but he might be first ballot Hall of Fame.
I know, but
there's a couple foul tips.
You can't give him full
okay.
credit on the Theremin because he did go beyond the buzzer on.
I'm woozy. I mean, it's just an athletic performance.
That was incredible. The whole interview was incredible. I've never. We had three guests in one. No, I was great.
That's what I thought.
We had
you were talking about
three
yourself.
guests in one today. We could have done 3 separate interviews with the different parts of your life.
Let's go to corner office and introduce one of our favorites, who is now a member of our team. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the infamous GI.
Let me point out. Drew is just so busy. Drew's doing really good now.
Right.
GI is going to sit in for him for a little while.
So GI, throw some questions our way.
Yeah, let's do it. So for the first one is from Mike Walls. Charlie, how did you approach producing for other artists versus producing tracks for yourself in terms of sonic direction and texture?
well, it's really about finding the past sonic kind of history of the band, listening to a band like White Zombie or Prong, and trying to identify what they do, and just trying to take 10%, a narrow scope of what I like. I'm not going to try to inject, Kraftwerk style robot synths into a super rock and heavy band, but just take, find that narrow scope of things that I like and think I know how to do, and try to bring that over, but really based on listening to their previous work and maybe even other bands that they like. And they might say something like, I've always been a fan of, Rob Zombie might say, I love The Cure,
right?
But that kind of sonic footprint, we can't appropriate that whole thing, but maybe we can get some influence from there. And so a lot of it's,
I do the same thing mix-wise when I'm trying to plan a mix.
try to find what other artists, the artists you're going to work with likes.
Yep. GI, throw us another.
Another one from Travis Long for Charlie. How did you get the synth bass sound for the 9-inch Nails Animal?
Wasn't involved in that track. That was Trent Reznor all the way.
And Trent had called me, and we worked through some stuff. I'll share that with your audience later. Throw us another one, GI.
This one is for Dave. What is your view on using headphones to mix, and is it viable?
Yeah, you know what? In the interest of time, GI, you with me every day. Let's do an ITL on that, okay? Because I got some real definite opinions. It's very, very useful to block out. If you're in a less than perfect room with lots of reflections, it's a great way to block out the reflections. But there's some EQ limitations involved too.
Go ahead, GI.
Next one is from Austin Russifer. Charlie, can you take us through the process of gearing up and preparing for the 9-inch Nails tour and what that was like?
It was a lot simpler than you would have thought, partly because there's so much destruction and chaos on stage that we couldn't have really complex, big synth rigs with all different stuff. Literally, in the years that I was in the band, although this changed in subsequent years after I left, but in my era, all the keyboard sounds on stage came out of Emax rack mount samplers or later emulator 4s. That was it. And we used brown metal original DX7s as controller keyboards, and that was it. And there's literally on stage you'd have a DX7 and a MIDI cable that went to a sampler, and that was it. And there was at one point I used, like I said, the auto-tune on the Theremin, and at one point I used a Nord micro modular to make one sound on one song, but 99% of it, and that was partly because DX7s you can buy in any city at any pawn shop, and they can take a beating, and they can be waterproof to a certain degree.
That's all those things being
And
important.
it was amazingly simple, just for sheer repeatability and for ease of the techs putting the stuff back together at the end of the night.
I'm gonna take your job, GI. In the current climate today of bands that you hear, is there any band where the keyboards have caught your attention and you go, wow, that was really well done? Is there a record that comes to mind? Perhaps an EDM record?
You know, obviously, not to jump on the bandwagon too much, but being a fan of Aphex Twin and Warp Records and all that really progressive synthesizer stuff from 10 years ago, when I hear Skrillex these days, I think, okay, dude is...
I know why you like him, because he's got that buzzy kind of
There's a great
incredible
heavy metal aesthetic to some of that stuff.
Skrill, if you're listening, I want you on the show, my friend.
Yeah. And also Diantwoord, this weirdo band from South Africa when I hear that stuff, I mean, I don't...
Spell that, say it again.
It's Diantwoord. And it's a hip-hop duo from South Africa, and it's raw and rugged, and the first time I heard it, I thought, okay, there's something fresh and awesome. And
point of personal pride, my stepdaughter brought that up to me 2 days ago.
Oh,
literally.
wow.
Really?
Yeah, she's got great taste.
I noticed a trend here, like when you order a filet, do you order it medium rare? Because you like raw. Everything is raw.
I mean, that's what, even growing up, bands that I liked were, I liked Led Zeppelin because it sounded like they were about to fall apart at any moment,
Especially live.
Yeah.
GI, you got a couple more over there?
Yep, sure do.
You know, one thing, GI, that we may have to work on with you is I'm Canadian and you're being more articulate than me. We're going to have to rough him up.
He's very erudite.
He's very erudite. Very formal. Go ahead, GI, fire away.
This next one is from Colin Ulrich. Charlie, what is your desert island synth that you couldn't live without?
Ooh, that is a tough one. Some of if it was a hardware synth, I would take a Roland V-Synth, any one of the three, just because it's kind of like the Camel Audio Alchemy plugin where you can take samples and really mess with them and time stretch and do all kinds of wacko stuff on it. And if it was a plugin, it'd be a toss-up between Omnisphere or Camel Audio Alchemy, both of which I love.
Do you use Massive much at all?
Somehow I don't. I have it and I use it, and it has real strong, it's got some real big strengths, but they're kind of not the kind of thing I need at the moment, so I don't wind up using it much,
sense. Yeah, I understand.
GI, we got time for 2 more quick ones, and say these in your urban articulation.
Will do.
Challenge.
All right, this one's from John Marsh. What techniques did you use for recording guitar on Size Matters by Helmet, and was it a mixture of amps and plugins?
All of the... Helmet is one of my favorite bands, and Page Hamilton is definitely a purist and very educated, and he's a jazz head and a boutique amp collector, and he's all that. So there wasn't any pods or plugins or anything. That was all his collection of amps, mic'd up very simply, basic tracked at cello before it turned into East-West, and then overdubs, including a lot of the guitars, were done at a house I used to rent, where we built a soundproof isolation box that was just like a low ceiling vocal room that you could go in and put cabinets and mic them up. And so that was mostly, I think, API mic preamps and good old 57s and Page Hamilton's collection of amps and speakers. And no plugins on that.
Last one, GI.
Last one from Chad Williams. Dave. What is your approach for getting synth, bass, edgy, and fat in the mix without getting in the way of bass and other sounds?
Yeah. Well, I worked with Colin quite a bit on Futzbox, that plugin from McDSP. I love that to add. I don't look at distortion as Elephant Man created sounds. I look at distortion as rich harmonics. So I like Futzbox. I like THC by Massey. Dirk Ulrich over at Brainworks just came out with a new plugin I like. I can't remember the name of it. It just came out, but it's his version of an amp simulator, but it's nothing like an amp simulator. Hey guys, I'm not going to fully answer that question. Ponder this and jump in, Charlie. I think guitar pedals are way underrated in the use of mixing. Think of them as poor man's outboard gear. I use a lot of guitar pedals in the mix process. They're incredible. Sometimes they just buzz automatically because the resistance is wrong. Sometimes they work great. I know Charlie loves them and uses them. So if you want an example, when I did Get the Party Started for Pink, I used the real Sansamp guitar pedal on her vocals. So you can go to a pawn shop and you can like quadruple your outboard collection for $25, $30 by using guitar pedals. They're very underrated.
I mean, I love using pedals so much. I have a setup with a pull-out shelf with 24 pedals, mostly distortions and echoes, and they're permanently powered up and wired up into a quarter-inch patch bass so that I can, either while playing guitar or even while mixing, just go through and just, no, I don't like that one. Because a lot of times they're one-trick ponies, and if you have to drag it out and change the battery, eventually you're going to get bored. But I love having them all in a patch bay, and I can just...
I didn't mean to be flippant with that answer, but GI, again, can you make a note? Because that's a great ITL and requires a little more time than I have within the scope of Corner Office. But I'll do an ITL if you remind me, you and Will.
Have Charlie wrap up his...
You know, Charlie, that original question, you got the end of the show today. Just, your journey is so unique, but yet there's little gems of knowledge that would just be enlightening to our audience. Can you just grab a couple of those moments that might be inspirational for a cat trying to start out where you started out at Sam Ash?
It's sometimes I look back and I wonder how the hell all that happened. But it all came down to just being interested in sound and sounds and listening to, I would listen to Talking Heads or Devo back in the day and think, how did they get these sounds? There's something I've never heard before. And that interest and always wanting to hear something I'd never heard before was what kept propelling me forward. And every time I'd fiddle with a synthesizer, I'd think, am I touching the outside edge of what I was hearing on those records? And is there a path for me to go further and discover how they did what they did? And that's why it's great that things like this resource exist now, where you can watch tutorials and hear from other people. When I was coming up, you'd read Mix Magazine and that was it, and you'd hope for a gem in there somewhere.
Is it fair to say, I'm sort of summing up your thing, you just got to be curious. You got to be hungry. You got to search.
Curiosity is the thing. I mean, I couldn't have predicted that I'd wind up doing the kind of things that I've done, but somehow, and a lot of credit goes to the people that hired me. Whether it's Rob Zombie or Trent Reznor, they were curious also, and they would see some weird thing I was doing and think, hey, maybe I can bring that into my party. Now
I'm curious. Is if we call you again, will you come back?
Sure.
This has been absolutely wonderful, man. Thank you
pleasure.
So much, Charlie. We've got plans for you.
Take the last word today. What's that cliche? Luck is where something meets something. That's the last word from her.
Hey, my grandma used to say, opportunity might knock, but you better be fully dressed when you answer the door.
You know what? It doesn't get better than that. Why don't you say goodbye?
Hey, guys, we missed you. See you next week.